I'm Richard Bush, and I'm very pleased to welcome you to our conference on U.S. Asia relations and the Trump administration. Yesterday we had a very good discussion of both the economic prospects for Asia and the prospects for Asian security. And a number of our conference participants who came from Asia provided us a lot of good perspective on that. But one thread that was running through the whole discussion was, profound uncertainty about the direction of the United States and the Trump administration. And so that's what we're going to address today. And four of my colleagues here are going to talk about various aspects of this discussion. First of all, William Galston, who is the Ezra K. Zilka Chair here at Brookings in the Governance Studies program. He's going to talk about what the campaign tells us about U.S. politics and its future. Bill was a former policy advisor to President Clinton, and he's an expert on domestic policy, political campaigns, and elections. Second, E.J. Dionne is a senior fellow here at Brookings. He's a syndicated columnist for the Washington Post, always worth reading, and university professor in the Foundation of Democracy and Culture at Georgetown University. Ted Geyer is vice president and director of the Economic Studies program here at Brookings. And the Joseph A. Peckman Senior Fellow at the Brookings Institution. And he's going to talk about the economy, obviously. And then Constanze Stelzenmüller is in the Foreign Policy Program. She's the inaugural Robert Bosch Senior Fellow in our Center on the United States and Europe. And she was at the German Marshall Fund of the United States before coming to Brookings. I think there's one PowerPoint presentation, so what I'm going to do is ask each of the speakers to come up in turn, and then we'll congregate after the presentations for Q&A. So Bill, would you like to go first?
Well, thank you, Dick. Is there going to be someone helping out with the timing? Because I thank you, because with so many speakers, I do not want to overstay my welcome. Perhaps the most quoted line of the U.S. presidential election was by a reporter named Selena Zito, who said that Mr. Trump's adversaries took him literally but not seriously, while his supporters took him seriously but not literally. It turns out that both his adversaries and his supporters were wrong. At least when it comes to U.S. foreign policy, they should have taken him both seriously and literally, because there has been a remarkable continuity between the election campaign and subsequent developments, or so I believe. I'm going to divide my remark into two parts. One, trying to redeem what I just said, and second, putting a few pieces of evidence from survey research on the table so you can see what the debate in the campaign actually revealed about American public opinion on issues that are relevant to today's gathering. I begin with my Brookings colleague, Thomas Wright, who did something very important in the middle of last year. He took Donald Trump both seriously and literally, sat down and worked through 3 decades of his public utterances and statements and writings, and concluded that this man was not a blank slate at all, that there were 3 issue areas where he had been ruthlessly, bluntly consistent for more than 3 decades. And they are the the evils or imbalances of our trade relations with the rest of the world, the devastating impact of uncontrolled or allegedly uncontrolled immigration on the United States society and economy, and third, the fact that that he believed that American foreign policy had turned into a charitable venture and that it was time to apply an American first perspective, which means a kind of very material balance sheet. Are we getting, in material terms, what we're giving, or are we being taken advantage of? And in the Trump universe, nothing is worse than being taken advantage of. And so we learned during the campaign that this perspective involved a transactional approach. We're on one side of the table. Our allies, actually our negotiating adversaries, even if they are allies, are on the other side of the table. And what do we give? What do we get? The balance sheet, the numbers don't work out. We should walk away from the table. We also learned that candidate Trump has a marked preference for bilateralism over multilateralism in both trade and international relations more generally. He prefers to go up with or against other nations one-on-one, in the belief that with the possible exception of one nation, and I'll come back to that nation in a couple of minutes, we will always prevail in a one-on-one negotiation. We learned during the campaign that he rejected the Trans-Pacific Partnership root and branch. People were not sure that Hillary Clinton meant it when she rejected TPP. They were quite sure that Donald Trump meant it. And I was from the very. I never doubted for a minute that he would rip it up as soon as he got into office. And he was against it in part for economic reasons, in part because it was multilateral, and in part because he really did not accept the logic that it was part of a regional security architecture. President Obama was absolutely right when he said that if the United States doesn't write the rules in the region, China would. But either candidate Trump didn't believe that, or he didn't care. He argued during the campaign, and I think this is likely to prevail, that China is more an adversary than a partner. That it was time to abandon a strategy of, in effect, tacitly enabling China's rise, and to think about matters differently. Mr. Trump is not the only person to have this thought, and I think a reasonable case can be made that U.S.-China relations have reached something of an inflection point, or at least a point where premises that have guided us for more than a quarter of a century will need to be debated. The final thing that became clear during the campaign is that there is a subset of Americans for whom the views that I've just stated turn out to be highly attractive and strongly mobilizing. People whose lives are going badly, people who crave not only an explanation for their disappointment, but also someone to blame. And in this connection, it became very clear that merely invoking abstract causes such as automation, globalization, demography, development, post-industrial society, forget about all of that. Right? If something's going wrong, you don't want to blame a sociological theory or an economic theory or a demographic theory. You want to blame someone or something in particular. Okay, those are a few of the things I think we learned during the campaign. Now, in the second half of my remarks, how am I doing on time, please? 5 minutes, perfect. Second half of my remarks, I just to try to lay out a few of the many things that we learned from high-quality survey research during this period. Number one, from the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, do Americans reject globalization? Answer, no, they don't. Overall, about two-thirds of Americans continue to believe that globalization is more good than bad for the country. 74% of Democrats believe that, but so do 59% of Republicans. When the question is not globalization, but rather trade, matters get more interesting. Also from the Chicago Council, is trade mostly good for the U.S. economy? Yes. American companies? Yes. Consumers like you? Yes. Your own standard of living? Yes. And Democrats and Republicans agree on those four propositions. But is trade as currently configured good for creating jobs in the U.S.? No. And both Democrats and Republicans agree to that. Does it promote job security for U.S. workers? Again, no, and both Democrats and Republicans agree on that. Interestingly, if you take not just a snapshot, but a view of these developments over time, you will see that the two parties have flipped position on trade. As recently as 10 years ago, Republicans were far more pro-trade and trade treaties than Democrats, and there have been absolutely huge, staggeringly large swings in that relationship ever since. So just to give you a few examples, is trade good for the U.S. economy? In 2006, Republicans by 8 percentage points were more likely to believe that proposition or to affirm that proposition than Democrats. 2016, Democrats were 17 percentage points more likely to affirm that proposition than Republicans. And I've reviewed in detail the chronology of each one of the 6 categories that I just laid out, and it's all, and the trends are all the same. Let me just conclude with a couple of minutes on China. There has been a sea change in American public attitudes toward China, I think reflected in this election. 10 years ago, 52% of the American people expressed favorable attitudes towards China versus 29% who expressed unfavorable attitudes. 10 years later, that 52% favorable rating turned into 38%. And the 29% unfavorable rating had almost doubled to 55%. There has been no change during that period in Chinese attitudes towards the United States, interestingly. And let me conclude with a remark out of area, so to speak, on NATO. Question. In case of a Russian attack on its neighbors, should the United States honor its Article 5 treaty obligations? Yes, 56, no, 37. Pretty good, especially when you stack it up to a lot of European countries. France, 47 say yes, 53% say no. And I regret to report that in Germany, only 38% returned an affirmative answer to that question, and 58% expressed grave doubts about Article 5 treaty obligations, a finding that I must say surprised me very much. And with that, on with the show.
Thank you very much. It's an honor to be with some of my very favorite Brookings colleagues. I want to thank Richard for asking me here. I feel very dearly about Richard because I met my wife 30 years ago this year, and she was working with Richard at the time on Capitol Hill. So I'm very happy to be here. And I'm happy we're still together 30 years later. The other thing I want to say is that when I was asked to talk about how we would govern ourselves in this period, my first response was laughter. And it was not a happy laughter. It was the laughter of how does one answer this question when so many of the signals are contradictory and when it is exceedingly difficult to figure out where this administration is at the moment on a number of issues. And I want to get to that. It's appropriate we're talking about this today because today there are two very big tests of how we will govern ourselves in this period. Test one is whether the Republicans in the House can pass this health care bill to repeal the Affordable Care Act, to repeal Obamacare, that is changing by the hour because they are still short of votes. The other is what is happening at this very moment in the House Intelligence Committee. Devin Nunes, as many of you know, yesterday made a series of statements in front of the White House that, to say the least, greatly bothered many of the Democrats on the committee, and I suspect quietly perhaps some of the Republicans. And there is great division on that committee. A lot of Democrats are saying that Mr. Nunes can't simultaneously be a defender of the president and investigate him at the same time. So I think these two showdowns will actually be quite revealing about where we are going. I just want to underscore a couple of things that Bill said that affect what I'm going to talk about. I do think that it's important to see that attitudes toward trade, in a sense, support for free trade has been deteriorating for a long time. President Clinton, who passed NAFTA, famously had difficulty with trade votes later on. And I think this very, very much affects attitudes toward China, because I think the loss of manufacturing jobs accelerated after 2000, 2001. And the loss of manufacturing jobs has had a powerful impact on the American economy. Donald Trump would not have won his exceedingly narrow victories in Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan without great concern about the loss of manufacturing. A lot of communities have been hollowed out by the loss of these manufacturing jobs. Those are the kinds of places where Donald Trump did slightly better than Mitt Romney did, and slightly better was enough. And so I think that this is an underlying theme, and as Bill suggested, you're seeing a change in the Republican Party and its attitudes toward trade. I think some of that are Republicans following the new leader of the Republican Party. But I also think it reflects a kind of skepticism. Now, as Bill also said, I don't think Americans want to blow up the entire global economy, but I think there is a degree of skepticism on both the right and the left, reflected in Bernie Sanders' campaign and the Trump campaign, that is very important. I want to underscore something about governance in this period. Since 1954, that is 63 years ago, the United States has only had, correct me if I'm wrong, Bill, 4.5 years of unified Republican government. That is to say, periods when the Republicans controlled the House, the Senate, and the presidency. Because when the Republicans started winning back either the House or the Senate, Bill Clinton was president. And you had the first roughly half year of President Bush's term, and then Senator Jim Jeffords of Vermont switched parties and the Democrats took over. The Republicans then took over both chambers in 2002, got them again in 2004, lost them in 2006. So there is actually very limited experience in the United States with unified Republican government. And I think that very limited experience also may affect the ability of the Republican Party to govern, because even in that 4.5-year period under President Bush, they had enormous difficulty enacting President Bush's program. And to go to today's vote on the Affordable Care Act, one of President Bush's signature initiatives after the 2004 election was to partially privatize Social Security. This was a proposal that he could not get through a Republican House. Why is that? Well, it is very hard to alter or take away a long-standing benefit. And it turns out that with the Affordable Care Act, it's not such a long-standing benefit. But there are now a lot of beneficiaries of the Affordable Care Act, and especially complicating the Republicans' task, a lot of those beneficiaries voted for Donald Trump. There is an American folk singer whom I have invoked as a political philosopher who once, Joni Mitchell, who once said, "You don't know what you got till it's gone." And what's happened with the Affordable Care Act is a lot of these beneficiaries have suddenly realized that its repeal would take their health care away. And so you are seeing resistance in the hardcore of the Trump constituency in states like Arkansas, West Virginia, Kentucky, Louisiana. These are states where a lot of people gain coverage. So I think that is a core Republican difficulty. The one area where, when Republicans controlled, they had some success is tax cutting. And I also think this has to do with where the interests of the two parties lie. A very thoughtful Democratic senator told me recently that part of the Republicans' problem on health care is they hadn't thought about it very much. And he was not making that as a partisan point. He was not saying Republicans were stupid. He was saying that we Democrats, because we had to pass the Affordable Care Act, had to educate ourselves on health care. Republicans, since they knew they were going to oppose the bill, went to other places. But even on tax cutting, I think you're going to see some interesting tensions inside this Republican coalition. Particularly between different sectors of the corporate economy in their attitude toward how to reform and cut the corporate tax. So there is a real problem there. On foreign policy, I think that it is very hard to read the Trump administration because there really seem to be two entirely different wings of the Trump administration within this government. It struck me that when General Mattis and Mike Pence were in Europe, they were giving reassurances on NATO that seemed quite different from some of the signals that were coming out of the Trump White House. I was wondering whether we had gone from an elected presidency to a constitutional monarchy where the cabinet was expressing the real views of the government and the president was speaking more symbolically. But I think it's entirely unclear where this goes. I think that within the Trump administration, there is a camp typically associated with Steve Bannon, his chief strategist, that is skeptical of the European alliance, obviously skeptical of the relationship with China, but particularly his focus is on Europe. I think it's very hard for anyone to predict where this conflict will take place. There's almost a little McCain camp inside the Trump presidency, and there's a very anti-McCain camp inside the Trump administration. So I think it's very hard to read where that will go. The last thing about governance that we cannot ignore, and I'll just return to where I started, is the ongoing investigation of the Trump administration's, Trump campaign's relationship with the Russian interference in the American election. I have the view, by the way, that I think in the long run, this will have been a very big mistake by Russia, because I think you are hearing particularly from the liberal and democratic side of American politics, a critique of Vladimir Putin and his regime that is more profound than you have heard from that side of politics in a long time. There is real anger, and there's also a focus on the Putin government that you have never seen in the American media before. So I think this could be a very long-term problem for Putin and Russia. But in the short term, it's a clear problem for the Trump presidency. And the testimony last week was not helpful to Trump. His tweet about President Obama having his, quotes, wires tapped was not helpful to President Trump. And I think that until we resolve this question of who and what happened in terms of collusion between anybody in the Trump campaign and this Russian effort, it will be a dominant issue in our politics, a dominant issue in our media, and it will make it even harder to govern a country that went into the Trump presidency very divided. Last point I want to make is to try to understand what the real political base of the Trump presidency is. I have two favorite numbers from the exit polling in the last election. First, I think it's very important to understand that Trump's margin of victory did not come from people who ardently support Donald Trump. It came from people who disliked both presidential candidates and disliked Hillary Clinton more. In the exit poll, 18% of Americans said they had an unfavorable view of both Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump. Those voters voted 47-31 for Donald Trump. They are the margin of victory. That is not the Trump base. They are people whose support for Trump is fragile, and I think that you are seeing that in the opinion polling, where President Trump is now down in a Quinnipiac poll yesterday. I think he was down at 37% approval, which is unheard of for a new president. He's even losing some ground among some of his core constituencies. If those of you who read my column know, I am not sympathetically disposed to President Trump. If I were to give him advice, I would say, your problem is not shoring up your base, although you're losing that. Your problem is that the Americans who voted against you are still against you, and some of the Americans who voted for you are moving against you, and you probably ought to think about doing something different. Thank you very much.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you, Richard, for the invitation. When I made this title, I had some reservations. I'm an economist, but I'm also an aspiring pretend psychologist. There's a great psychology study that judges judge more harshly before lunch than they do right after lunch. And so when I'm talking about what's going well and what's not, I feel like I should disclose I have yet to have breakfast, so that might influence my presentation of the facts on the ground a little bit. But so be it. And what might happen is a steady state of confusion no matter what I've eaten or not eaten. So I'm going to just give a little bit of what's going well. I'm going to just give a landscape of the economy as we know it and touch on some policies that my colleagues have already referred to. This is on the what's going well. What's going well is job growth. 77 consecutive months of job growth. We've added about 15.5 million jobs since the depths of the Great Recession. A couple years ago, we were averaging about 187,000 jobs a month, which is well above what you need to lower the unemployment rate. It kind of ebbed a little bit, and then in recent months, it's kind of gone gangbusters again. You can't interpret too much from just a few months, but we've had about 240,000 jobs per month the last few months. So you can see the great trough of the Great Recession, all those job losses, and we've been digging out ever since at a fairly substantial pace, which leads to the question of, how much more digging out can we do? And this is a view of where the unemployment rate is. I'm focused on the middle line. The gray line is the unemployment rate. Keep in mind, unemployment rate is how many people don't have a job divided by how many people are actively looking for a job. So it's conditional on looking for a job. And you can see we're at 4.7%, which is lower than we were before the recession. So if you were to just look at that measure, which you wouldn't want to just look at one measure, we are fully recovered and at full employment. And I'll give some of the conditions of that. One of the things you heard a lot, especially during the campaign, was that the unemployment rate was rigged or somehow misrepresenting. That, I think, is an egregiously unfair characterization. But I think the honest look at it is there's more than one way to look at the economy. So if you look at the top line, what you have there is what we call the U6. So remember, unemployment is how many people are not working divided by how many people are actively looking. Well, you might have some people who are working on a temporary job when they'd rather be full-time, or maybe they've just recently given up. They're just what we call discouraged workers. So there's lots of ways. The idea of looking for people who are actively working, only focusing on ones actively looking, is if you're retired, we don't want to count you as weakness or slack in the labor force. But even by the more expansive definition of unemployment, you can see we're almost back to where we started at the beginning of the recession. Not quite, but 9.2%, which is only slightly elevated. So there again, the job market is looking fairly robust. And then the last one was fairly unique to this recession, which was the long-term unemployment rate, This is unemployment conditional on being unemployed for more than 26 weeks. And there's all sorts of problems of trying to get back into the labor market after you've been unemployed that long. We had a historic peak there as well during the recession and in the aftermath. And there again, we are back to pretty much back to pre-recession levels. So again, all this is good news in a sense of we're close to full employment. Now, full employment is, in some sense, a term of art, and a lot of what Bill and EJ was reflecting, I think, reflects the underlying discontent that's going on in our population. So one might wonder, like, how can you claim you're fully employed with a very low unemployment rate and still claim that and still observe all this discontent? And one of the aspects of this is both economic and a little bit has political ramifications is labor force participation. So if you're out of the labor force altogether, you're not included in the unemployment rate. And as you can see for men, this is for all ages, we've had just in the last few decades just consistent decline in men's participation in the labor force. Women, we had kind of the surge in the 50s and 60s through the 80s and into the 90s of women entering the labor force. It plateaued in the 90s. And there again, in subsequent years, it actually diminished. So our labor force participation now for women, I think, is even less than countries like Japan, for example, so it's gone down. Now, this is a little bit of a misleading figure because this is everybody. So some of the reasons you see the decline is because of an aging population. So we can age adjust and show that picture, and I'll get to something similar too. Some of it is we had a decline because of the recession. I think that is now behind us. And some of it is what economists call a secular trend, and that's another way of saying we don't know. And that is if you look at a 35-year-old today, and you compare that 35-year-old male today, and you compare it to a 35-year-old male a generation ago, that person is less likely to be in the labor force. And there's all sorts of theories of why that might be, some more kind of damaging than others. And I'll get to that in a second. Another measure, these are all kind of quantity measures. How many jobs do we have? What's the unemployment rate? And, as I said, there's multiple measures. Another kind of reliable measure is a price measure, which is if the labor market is tight, you would expect wages to increase. And, that first picture I showed you of month after month of job gains, we were getting that, but the wage growth was relatively flat after the big drop. It was flat. So as if you're sitting in the Federal Reserve, you're like, we should keep easing because there's obviously more slack in the labor force because there's no upward pressure on wages. And in other words, we're still digging out. And subsequently, in the last few months, last year, we've seen wage growth, suggesting a tightening of the labor force, which influences policy, but obviously in and of itself is a good thing for the economy and for people's welfare. So I'm going to turn to the bad news, and I'm going to get back to the labor force participation. And so the question is, we talked about demographics, but if you just focus on prime age men, these are not retirees, these are not young students, these are prime age, working age men in the U.S., you can see the dashed black line. And what you see, and that's comparing you to a bunch of other developed countries, and you can see across the world, prime age men have reduced their labor force participation. And what is striking to me about this picture is if you look at the U.S., we went from being on the high end on labor force participation in the early years here to on the low end near the bottom, I think compared to Italy in recent years. So something is happening in the U.S. differentially than it's happening in other developed countries that are leading men to not participate in the labor force. And again, I'm going to this is where my lack of breakfast will show through and get a little bit despairing on everything. If you focus on education level, you can see that obviously education makes a big difference. Now, if you go back to the 60s, pretty much every working age man was in the labor force, right? You either worked, you were unemployed and looking for work, or you were dead. I mean, that was pretty much it. And so it's, close to, if you go back to the 40s, it's like 98%. It didn't matter what your education level was, you were in the labor force. And we can see that that for all levels of education, more or less, have declined. College's level relatively flat, but you can see what happens to people without a high school, or even indeed with a high school education. They're considerably dropping out of the labor force. we just published a paper here today at Brookings to be presented tomorrow on a follow-up study on the mortality rates for middle-aged, low-educated whites. And there's been a shocking increase in mortality rates, reversing a long-term decline in that trend, driven primarily by opiates, alcohol, and suicides. And so it's just, I think the authors use something like cumulative despair or that's leading to this. And so this, especially the bottom black line, I think is an element of that despair. Other numbers just related to that. What are all these men doing if they're not in the labor force when they used to be? They're spending on average 2,000 hours per year watching some screen. About half of them, half of the prime-age men who've dropped out of the labor force take pain medication. So they're in pain or addicted to pain medication. As I said, mortality rates are increasing. I mean, there's a whole host of social indicators suggesting bad shape. And when we get back to this kind of dispassionate, cold view of just how the economy's doing, how much slack is in the labor force, these are people that are probably not, given the current conditions, going to be re-entering the labor force. I'll try and go relatively quickly through these pictures. The picture on the left shows you the U.S. economy over about 140 years. The blue line is the size of the economy. You can, if you look closely, see the Great Depression, but then you see a spike up. And so the red line is the growth rate. And so what you see overall is when we have a declining growth, we follow it up with faster than average normal growth to make up for it, and we basically stay on a 3% trend. If you look at the figure at the right, you're seeing what's happened since 2008. That green line is what happens if the economy continued on the long-term trend. Those dots show you that we had a recession and we never caught up. And in fact, if you look at the gap between them, it's increased over time. So that's problematic. And you have kind of a little bit of perhaps a riddle here with an explanation, which is we've added all these jobs in recent years, but yet our economy is not growing very strongly. You put that together, how much output is each additional person contributing to the economy, and you have a measure called labor productivity. How productive are our workers? And you can see different periods here, and if you look before the recession, starting in 2005, there was a reduction in productivity, and that productivity reduction has gotten worse. I'm getting signaled for 1 minute, so I'm going to shelve my explanations for why that might be happening and just get quickly to the to the policy landscape. This is where a lot of uncertainty comes in, and my colleagues mentioned some of this. I'm going to sort of intellectualize the Trump economic agenda in a way that they haven't, but so be it. There are three theories, I think, of what explains the weak growth that we've seen in all the figures that I've just showed. Theory one is what we call secular stagnation, that the economy has a lack of aggregate demand. It calls for stimulus. People are underinvesting, and so therefore we need to stimulate the economy through fiscal policy. By and large, this to some degree was the economic explanations adopted by the Obama administration. Theory two is we ran out of low-hanging fruit. There's not enough innovation out there because you can only discover electricity and indoor plumbing once, and it's sort of kind of bred into it that we should expect slow growth going forward. Theory three is that the economy has been suffering death by 1,000 cuts, and those cuts are high tax rates and regulations. I think in the academic community that's a minority view, but it is a view. And I think the Trump agenda and the goal for 3.5 to 4% growth, which given the growth projections of growth in the labor force and where productivity is, would be enormously difficult to do. I hope they make it, but the theory is that those regulations and tax rates are holding us back, which leads to the policy agenda as we currently see it. A few of Bill and EJ mentioned trying to repeal the ACA, which is politically very difficult. That entails tax cuts, particularly on the high income. It also entails getting rid of the mandate. We could talk about what that means. And replacing the subsidies with a tax credit and really getting the cuts in the expenditure side on Medicaid. Politically, I don't know where that ends up. It probably makes it through the House tomorrow, and then the Senate is kind of interesting. The politics of it is they kind of have to get past it, whether or not they call it a day and just pretend that they've done something and do something kind of pro forma, or they do something substantial because they're really lining up for corporate tax reform. And there again, there's an internal debate about how deep to go and how much the idea there is to shift more towards a consumption tax, which would have some winners and losers because it would call for a border tax adjustment between imports and exports. There again, we're going to see, I think at the end of the day, we get tax cuts. I think the market sees tax cuts. How deep they are depends on how they can work out this border tax adjustment issue. I'll shelve my discussion of regulation. There, the Trump administration has a lot of administrative leeway to at least slow the administrative state and the ongoing regulations moving forward. I think they've acted on that, and there are a lot of interesting ideas going through Congress, which obviously would take a legislative approach, and I think a filibuster-proof approach to change the dynamics of regulatory reform to increase the amount of power that the judiciary and Congress would have before the future administrations were to pass large regulations. And that would be a rather fundamental change in how we do regulations here in the U.S., but I think that is lower on the agenda right now. But in the meantime, the administration itself can kind of exert a lot of influence on slowing down the pace of regulations, as we've seen. So I'll finish there and look forward to the questions. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. I'm European. I don't have a PowerPoint. All right, that was just a little bit of cheap snobbery. I admit that, Bill. I also, I used to write about defense and security, and I've been around too many of the military. The military actively, I think, break out in hives, particularly American generals, but also German generals, if they don't have a PowerPoint. I actually witnessed David Petraeus once having to give a talk in Berlin and being informed at the last possible moment that he could not show his PowerPoint because there was no provision for it. And if you want to see an American four-star general discombobulated, this is the way to go. It's actually kind of fun, I have to say. So I, obviously, having been preceded by three very distinguished speakers, all with a great deal of knowledge about American politics and economics and the worldview, I am not going to be so foolhardy as to try and make an incursion on their terrain. So what I've decided to do is slightly redefine my topic and tell you what this all looks like from a European vantage point. I myself, as you may have guessed, I'm from Germany. I've been living here for the last 2 years, but I am a sort of European foreign and security policy generalist. I go back to Europe all the time. And I think I have a fairly good sense of how this is going over, as you might say, in not just in Berlin, but in other European capitals. And I think my first important point to make to you is that we may not have realized it at the time, but the 8 years of the Obama administration were something of a high point for transatlantic relations, a high point where the Europeans actually were pushed, in some ways a little bit unwillingly, but were pushed quite deliberately by the White House to take on more responsibility for security provision in their own backyard. And if we want to be completely frank, and because I also want to be bipartisan about this actually started in the second half of the George W. Bush administration. You will recall that George W. Bush came into the White House with a distinctly dim view of Europe. His Secretary of Defense, Mr. Rumsfeld, had an even dimmer view. Remember the famous quote about old Europe versus new Europe. That shifted quite significantly in the second term. And relations by the end of the Bush administration were actually quite cordial. Now, right now things look a tad different. And they are, I think my predecessors were right to say that the picture is still inconclusive. What we're seeing from Europe is something of a tension within this administration between what you could call the traditionalists and the ideologues, and that tension is very obviously unresolved. We've seen a couple of plays and counterplays, but it's not at all clear who will win out here. I, by the way, agree with Bill. I also took President Trump both literally and seriously, and continue to do so. And I think in the field that we're talking about, particularly the hard power and security field, as you know, words can have the weight of nuclear weapons. And not least because, and this maybe speaks to our economist colleagues, that our field is something of a futures market, and words lead to things being priced in before they're actually turned into policy. Now, it's also worth saying that from a European vantage point, these traditionalists are on some levels reassuring because they say things that we're used to hearing about NATO and the EU, which is that this is good and in America's interest, and also in ours, obviously. But in some ways, they're actually not that traditionalist. And in fact, I have to confess, I was on a chat show last fall before the election with a very well-known German politician of Die Linke, former finance minister, a pretty hardline ideologue, Oscar Lafontaine, might be known to one or two of you, who said, or repeated his often stated opinion that America, and particularly Hillary Clinton, was all about Staatsmonopol Kapitalismus, state monopoly capitalism, and the military-industrial complex. And I, at the time, more or less went nose to nose with him and said that this was crude and hadn't even been cool at the time that these terms were invented. Now, if you look at the current cabinet, there is some case to be made that Eisenhower would actually recognize a military-industrial complex in some of the appointments. There is an awful lot of Goldman Sachs in there, and of course a lot of generals. But the thing that I think really is of concern to Europeans, and particularly to Germans, is of course the ideologues. And the ideologues, it has been noted, aren't actually in cabinet positions. They are in advisory positions that haven't required them to have to get a congressional appointment or hearings, but they appear to have the ear of the president. And we know from their writings and from the videos of their speeches, such as Steve Bannon's famous speech to the Vatican, that they have fairly forceful views on what the world is heading for, and particularly what's good and not so good about Europe. And here, I think it's there's two things that strike Europeans as different from previous thinking on the American right. One, that this is actually not really traditional right-wing thinking in the way that we know it, or even conservative thinking that we've become familiar with on the American right. It's also quite distinct from American neoconservative thinking. And in some ways, what you have here is a juxtaposition that we also see in Europe between defenders of open societies, of political pluralism, of representative democracy, and of a liberal world order, and opponents who say all of this is actually destroys civilization, destroys the primacy of the white man. And what we need to go back to are societies that are much more closed, that are much more white, and less burdened by entangling alliances. What's also concerning from a European point of view is that there appears to be in the rhetoric of the ideologue a distinct emphasis on war, and on war as something that is actually beneficial because it leads to, as it were, a cleansing of an unfortunate state of affairs and a renewal. This is rhetoric that particularly we Germans are familiar with and don't, really sort of don't have any particular need to. How do I put this without being really rude? But it's something that we thought we had gotten over, let me put it that way. And of course, we also thought it couldn't happen here. There's three elements to this war narrative, and all of them, I think, have serious ramifications for Europe, and particularly for my country, Germany. The culture war narrative, the trade war narrative, and the war narrative. The culture war narrative is the one that says, basically builds on Samuel Huntington's Clash of Civilization, only more so. It blends fairly seamlessly with the narrative of white supremacists, who have, in fact, been celebrating this fact on social media. If you care to follow that, I have been following it. It's not pleasant to see, but it's instructive. And in this narrative, of course, Europe is beset by Muslim hordes who are aiming to overthrow the achievements of Judeo-Christian culture, and the figure who has been particularly egregiously harmful to Judeo-Christian supremacy in this context is Angela Merkel by, as it were, opening the Fulda Gap to these Muslim hordes by letting in Syrian refugees, 800,000 of them, Syrians and others, it has to be said, in 2015. Now, I don't think I need to say to you how reductionist and crude this analysis is. It completely leaves out the role of both America and Europeans and the Russians, indeed, in Middle Eastern wars that has led to this migration outflow and this influx into Europe. But this narrative alone is enough, I think, to separate a sort of modern, pluralist, democratic European from this thinking. Then there's the trade war narrative. That's been much on evidence recently, not just in the Merkel visit here to the president, but also in the pronouncements of, inter alia, Peter Navarro, the new head of the new Trade Protection Council, or the op-eds written by Mr. Malloch, who appears to still be on course, or want to be on course for U.S. ambassador to the EU. And finally, there's the security narrative. The security narrative, of course, is one that we have also become intimately familiar with, not least through the president's tweets. One in which NATO is a transactional affair, in which America protects Europe, and Europe pays dues for that. It appears to be a thinking that is sort of a melange between a golf club and a protection racket. And that is, you've had several American former ambassadors to NATO explaining why this is actually not what the Washington Treaty, the NATO treaty, is about. It's not that this alliance also protects American interests. It has been mentioned that European nations pay for American bases. I think we cover about roughly a third of the cost of American bases in Europe. But still, these images are very powerful, and it's something that we are clearly going to have to deal with. The point that I think most concerns us, because the president has been making some conciliatory noises about NATO and about European individual partners, the point that most concerns us, I think, is the more or less open hostility to the EU, which has been variously described as unaccountable, undemocratic, and in fact inimical to transatlantic security interests in the writings of some Washington think tanks. That at a time when Europeans, of course, realize the failings and the defects of the European Union, of course realize that some of its regulations, its bureaucracy, it needs to be pruned, but are at the same time discussing the need for further, deeper integration among at least some European partners on issues of common concerns that we believe we cannot solve otherwise, such as Eurozone management, such as the management of immigration, and such as common defense and security. That, I think, is the single greatest source of concern in the rhetoric of this administration. And again, the thing that is most worrying to Berlin is that we know if there's one country in Europe that is the most dependent, whose prosperity and whose security, whose standing, if you will, and whose leadership in Europe is most dependent on the EU, it's my own country, Germany. And as some of you will know, if you followed this, Germany has been very explicitly singled out by a number of the advisors of this administration as a problem in this context. So the bottom line here is that we appear to have a situation that is still unresolved because there's the tension between the ideologues and the traditionalists on how to deal with NATO, with the EU and Europe is a remains on the cards. I think we will see it. It is highly likely that we will see it flare up in a situation of crisis. And I can tell you that Europeans are already pricing this in. This is driving, together, of course, with Russian aggression in Eastern Europe and Russian, shall we say, meddling in the Middle East. This is driving European efforts for integration, and it is particularly driving European efforts for defense and security integration. Now, at this point, that'll be my last sentence and then I'll stop. At this point, these efforts are made in the hope of maintaining a constructive, cooperative, and cordial relationship with the United States, because no sane person in Europe believes that we can handle any of these challenges without the support and the backing of the United States. And so all of this thinking, particularly on European defense and security, is not designed in a way to throw the Americans out of Europe or to throw NATO out of Europe. In fact, that would be the worst thing that could happen to us. It is all designed in such a way as to be interoperable with NATO. But there is, I think I have to say, I have to be honest to you. I have not seen in my 20 years of writing about this particular space and about these policy issues such a sense of doom and gloom about American policy towards Europe. And I'll stop here.
Thanks to the four of you for outstanding presentations. No need to rush. While my colleagues are getting seated, I will tell you that we're not going to have breaks. You can go back and get coffee or tea, whatever you want. The restrooms are through the double doors back there. I have a lot of questions, but I'm going to restrain myself and just ask one. And this is for whoever wants to answer. Bill probably has a view, EJ, Ted maybe. And that is the one force in American society that has been kind of quiet since January 20th, and even before, is the American business community, sort of represented by the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, which is on H Street and looks right across Lafayette Park at the White House. So you'd think they would know where to go if their interests were threatened. The American business community understood that TPP was good for America. It understands that a trade war with China would be a disaster. And in my day, if the business community were worried about threats to the open trading system, they would get quite proactively opposed to those threats. So what's going on?
Well, I'll give you a very brief and very cynical answer. Mm-hmm. Right now, my reading of the business community is that they are focused first and foremost on what they expect to get later this year and next year, namely substantial tax reform, which will actually be major corporate income tax cuts, coupled with substantial regulatory reform. And I suspect their long-term strategy is to pocket those gains and then fight back on trade, and hoping that things don't get too bad, while they're playing nice with the administration in order to get what in the short term they really care most about.
I completely agree with that, and I just want to underscore that over about a 40-year period, the organized business community, which is different from individual business people, has moved sort of substantially to the conservative side of the spectrum. Business was always more conservative. It was Republican. But you can see sort of the difference between kind of Eisenhower Republicanism, Reagan Republicanism, and Trump Republicanism. And that helps explain what Bill just said about pocketing the gains that they want, tax reform, deregulation. What you wonder is, at some point, does Trump bring about a reckoning inside the organized business community to say, actually, in the long run, these policies aren't good for us, aren't good for the American economy? I don't have great confidence that'll happen, but it might happen.
I'll just add a couple words to all this. And Constanta talk about pricing things in. So the market, and I would not I said I'm an economist but an amateur psychologist, so I would not overinterpret the market as being correct or accurate indicator of what will happen, as evidenced by the markets for the election. The market reaction has been strong, both in the stock market and in measures of volatility, and including things like the Small Business Optimism Survey, which really took off right after the election. So if you were to interpret the market reaction to that, it's consistent with what Bill said. Some view of corporate tax and individual tax rate reductions, some view of deregulation, perhaps substantial deregulation, and less of a concern, for whatever reason, on the trade aspect. Now, it could be totally wrong, but I think that's at least the initial market reaction.
Thank you very much. I'm going to stay standing so I can see people. The protocol is the same. Raise your hand if you want to ask a question. Wait for the mic, identify yourself, and keep your questions brief. I saw Lauren Hershey in the back first.
Thank you all very much. Very insightful. Glad I got downtown in time to listen to everything. And I hope your words get around to many different quarters in this city. My question is simply about TPP. I heard the other day that the Australian Prime Minister suggested maybe China ought to take U.S.'s role and TPP be rolled out accordingly. What do you see? What do you think?
Lauren, I think the next panel is an ideal time to ask that question. We're talking about economic integration.
On economic integration, I want to thank Mr. Gayer, if I pronounce your name correctly. You said there were certain rationales you were going to leave for the Q&A. Would you provide those, please?
I think those were particular to the productivity measures. There's different theories of why productivity is so weak, and it's a little bit of an East Coast, West Coast divide. If you go to the West Coast and speak to the chief economists at Google, they say the numbers are all wrong. There's innovation everywhere, and if you look on the East Coast, that's less so. We can get into the technicalities of it, but really what it comes down to is when in 2006 you're carrying your flip phone and BLS prices that at $100. In 2007, you buy an iPhone for $300. That's not inflation, right? So how much of that was the quality of the product has changed, and how much of that is the product actually increased in price? It's actually an existential question for economics, because if you can't answer that correctly, you can't, at a dinner party, answer the question, is the economy doing well or not? I think that there are a lot of complications in making those measurements. I think they have always existed. So in order for those productivity numbers to be wrong, the difficulty, the error had to increase over time. And I think the evidence suggests that it has not. And I think to argue otherwise is also to have to face my colleagues in the political science realm and basically tell them, like, all these people are upset because they think we're telling them real GDP is this, but in actuality, real GDP is a lot higher, so they shouldn't be so upset. And I don't think that's a plausible argument as well.
Bill?
Could I just say one thing on your question? I think one of the interesting ways in which the argument here in the United States could develop is that Trump ran rhetorically, at least, as a very tough critic of China, including the way he pronounced it, had a very particular way of pronouncing China. Oh, thank you. Yeah. And I think one of the intriguing questions is whether his policies overall might have the effect of strengthening China's hand in Asia, and whether that will produce, if not in his political base, in the policy world, a kind of backlash and a reconsideration, just as his policies in Europe could alienate allies there. And so I think that the stories like the one you described could be the beginning of this debate about whether Trumpism actually achieves the goal that it set for itself, and there's reason to believe that it might actually be counterproductive.
Bill?
Well, just a couple of comments. First of all, and Ted will correct me if I get this wrong, but business investment since the recovery has been remarkably weak. And there is a relationship between business investment and productivity gains. Secondly, labor has become cheaper. And there's a reason why so many people are being hired. They don't cost very much. And I think that those two factors are going to have to change for the productivity numbers to go up. With regard to China, let me make a couple of points. Some of you have heard me make the first one. First of all, I think we have to acknowledge that the impact of China's accession to the WTO on the U.S. manufacturing base before the Great Recession started at the end of 2007 was profound. And some of our best labor economists have confirmed this proposition repeatedly. We lost 3.3 million manufacturing jobs between 2001 and the end of 2007. Right? More, almost 50% more than we lost during the Great Recession itself. And the recovery in manufacturing has been minuscule. That is close to the silver bullet explanation for the public discontent that pushed Donald Trump into office. And this is an administration, whether rightly or wrongly, that cares a lot about bilateral trade deficits, whether they are with China or Germany. And I think it would be the better part of wisdom on the part of both the Chinese government and the German government to take that metric seriously as it deals with the United States.
Could I just underscore that by referring to Ted's excellent presentation? I agree with everything Bill just said. And there were two interesting facts, well, they were all interesting facts, but two relevant facts to the politics and the economics. He showed the decline in male labor force participation, which is, I think, part of what is happening to produce Trump, which comes partly from this decline in manufacturing. So that's a social crisis for the United States. But then he also showed the flattening of female labor force participation, which was, in a sense, inevitable because you couldn't get to over 100% female labor force participation. And many households, in a period when wages were flat, kept their living standards up by sending more people in the workforce. But you run out of people in the household to send into the workforce, so that when you put together what Bill said, the decline in male labor force participation and a flattening of female labor force participation, you have a recipe for discontent, even if the overall economic numbers are good.
Just two quick amendments that I have a slide on men, because I think there's been a kind of an interesting story about male drop in participation in some of the social afflictions. The good news is I think pretty soon I'm going to have to revise my slides, because female labor force participation is dropping. The mortality risk for middle-aged whites, if anything, has gone up by more for women than for men on some of these measures. So maybe the men were a leading indicator, but it's not looking good. And then just one other addendum.
Which only means the situation is actually even worse.
Yes,
yeah,
exactly right. Yeah. One good criticism of my slide is, what about women? And I think it's just, maybe I'm just not adjusting to the new realities. Just a quick addendum to what Bill said about trade deficits. A lot of those policies that we put up there would all lead to the appreciation of the dollar. Tax cuts, border tax adjustments in particular. So it's just a certain irony that would hurt the fundamental trade deficits, which speaks to the point that on an economic matter, trade deficits are irrelevant. It's what's causing it and what are the underlying fundamentals.
Julia Chang-Block. Oh, I'm sorry.
Can I just briefly say something
Please,
to
please.
Bill's
I'm
remark
sorry, I didn't see
about
it.
Germany? And that is that there is actually a real debate within Germany about the utility of Germany's multiple surpluses. As we know, the German finance ministry is intransigent on this point. They are intransigent in ways which are, I think, criticized even within Angela Merkel's cabinet. But Mr. Schäuble is in a very strong position and knows how to be intransigent. But there's a real argument to be made that we should reduce those surpluses. I think the theory underlying the administration critique is, shall we say, a little crude and in some ways disassociated from reality. But the fact is that we need to do something about our surpluses for other reasons, not least because of the political divides that they produce within Europe. And the rationale, of course, the finance ministry's rationale for the surpluses is we need this because of our demographics. We're an aging society. We need to hedge against the future. But actually, with the kind of savings that we have now, we can do that and still spend on wages or on domestic investment or, in fact, on so we say, European youth unemployment insurance. All these things are feasible and I believe should be done. The same is true for German defense spending. Of course, we need to increase our defense spending. At the same time, the 2% measurement is actually not, it's a non-binding benchmark, and it's an input benchmark, which means it says absolutely nothing about the quality of what you get out of that defense. And of course, at a time when the Russians are meddling through propaganda and other things, a lot of our defenses start in the political arena, not in the security arena, where we need to increase the effectiveness of our protection.
Okay, I'm going to take 3 questions from up front. First, Julia Changblock, and then Aki, and then Wu Xinbo.
U.S. China Education Trust. Since this panel is about America's future, perhaps it's a little too early since President Trump has not yet completed 100 days. But I would like to hear more from the panelists about your perceptions and your prognostications about America under Trump. Can you comment particularly on America's standing in the world? There's a lot of, I think Constanza, I can't pronounce your last name, said doom and gloom. There's a lot of that around in this country, around the world today. But do you think that President Trump has irreparably ended America as the leader of the free world?
Okay. Pass the mic to Aki, please, right there. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Aki Tanaka, the University of Tokyo. I would like to ask questions which no panelists had talked a lot. That is the future process of forming the government. It's exceedingly slow process of forming the government. Cabinet level, we see a good number of people, but then sub-cabinet level, we don't know who formed the Trump administration. When can we expect the Trump administration will be built? And this process of slow formation of government, what kind of implications that we foreigners have to expect?
And then Wu Xinbo.
Wu Xinbo from China. EJ, you suggested at the end of your remarks that Trump may need to make some adjustments given the declining approval rate. I just wonder whether he would look at things this way, because if he learned anything from his campaigning experiences, that the opinion poll is not reliable. Otherwise, he wouldn't have won the election given the opinion polls, right, during the campaigning period. But more seriously, I think given the U.S. political cycle, the elect president usually has the first 2 years to push his own political agenda, really have a free hand if the if the Congress is on his side. Maybe after the midterm election, if Republicans lose the Senate, or he began to think more seriously about his next campaigning to get reelected, maybe he will make some adjustments. But I mean, having said that, I would be more interested to hearing your analysis about why his supporters also began to oppose him and what he should do if he really wants to make some adjustments. Thank you.
Okay.
I'll try the second one a little bit. So they are slow on the sub-cabinet level. They've made up some steam recently. I know I just followed Treasury in particular, so they've named a deputy 2 undersecretaries and I think 2 assistant secretaries. Still leaves a few assistant secretaries, undersecretaries there. So they're getting there. I guess I don't know. You asked from the implications from other countries. I'm thinking from the U.S. process. I don't know if it's deliberate or not. That's one of the kind of fun parlor games everybody's been playing the last few months. Every time Trump does something, is this deliberate or is this madness? There's certainly an effort, and we see this in executive orders as well, to up-power the political aspects of the agencies relative to the civil service. There's a 2-for-1 rule in promulgating any regulations. There's the appointment of will be the appointment of people that have to oversee that in every agency. The non-appointment of these political positions, in some sense, runs counter to that ambition, but in another sense, has seemed to me to solidify more of the policy-making power, at least on the economic side, within the White House, and leave the cabinet secretaries at a disadvantage, which I think harms policy, but again, might be deliberate.
Someone went to God and asked, when will Trump fill all the jobs in his government? And God replied, not in my lifetime. I think that Trump has several problems at once.
I thought the quote was, God knows.
One is that there are a lot of people, including Republicans, who don't want to serve in his government. 2, that there are a lot of veto points in his administration where people his cabinet officers want to bring in are vetoed by some force in the center. And 3, Trump never expected to get elected president, and so went in unprepared to fill the government, which goes to the poll point I want to get to. Second point, you raised a very profound question about America's standing in the world, and my favorite quip on that is the Churchill line, Americans always do the right thing after first exhausting all of the other possibilities. And we are doing an excellent job right now of exhausting all of the other possibilities. But I am very, very worried about the heart of your question. I don't have an answer to it, but I do worry that our influence in Asia could slip away rather rapidly. And this is a policy that seems almost designed to alienate our friends in Western Europe, at least in part of the Trump administration, but not all of the Trump administration. So I very much worry about this. I just like to think we can eventually recover, but I think it's what you describe as a great danger. Last, on your question, first of all, I can guarantee you that President Trump will not listen to a word I say. I don't even think he knows necessarily what I say at all and doesn't care. On the polls, I think it's very important to recognize the polls didn't get it wrong in the sense that Hillary Clinton beat Donald Trump by 2.9 million votes. The polls probably underestimated the number of discontented white working class voters who had dropped out of the electorate in 2012, couldn't vote for Romney, who came back in and voted for Donald Trump. That's my guess about why those 3 states flipped the other way. The only hope I have is that Trump is clearly not a person of deeply held views, and therefore, at least on an awful lot of things, and therefore at some point will take a look around and say, this isn't working. We'll see what happens on the vote today on the health care bill. I don't know if he's capable of doing that. A good start would be to apologize for that tweet about President Obama. If he does that, then maybe we can see the possibility of change.
All right. Well, on the cabinet or the senior appointments, I think we have word from the horse's mouth for that, which is President Trump's remarks on Fox and Friends, where he was asked about that and said, we are not filling those positions deliberately because we don't think they're necessary. I think this is part of the starving bureaucracy tactic. I think this is part of reducing the government. Again, for me as a European, this is an interesting phenomenon. Well, it's interesting because to me it fits in with a longer trend in American attitudes towards the state as a provider of public goods. That is, there is just a different cultural attitude in this country, as opposed to what as European attitudes and particularly German attitudes, where the state is still pretty much accepted as a potentially effective, often effective and legitimate arbiter in the provision and distribution of public goods, and who is supposed to be in a sort of a balance with the markets and with society in this role. You know? Whereas my sense is that here, at least for the last 30 years, since the Reagan Revolution, the state has been delegitimized and made less effective step by step as a provider of public goods, and I think we're seeing some of the impact of that. So that's one point. The other thing, I'll also answer the question about U.S. standing in the world, if I may. You know, questions like this sadden me. Because I am what in Germany is called, sometimes with a critical undertone, a committed transatlanticist, and because I'm very fond of this country, and because I admire so much about it. And I do believe, I'm going to be honest with you, I think that some of the attitudes, I wouldn't call them policies, but some of the attitudes enshrined in the rhetoric and the actions of this administration harm that standing. But I also believe that America is, you know, a very multifaceted animal, and it's not all one government. All of us, I think, and this is true for Asian countries as well as Europeans, engage with America on multiple levels. Whether we send high school students or graduate students to you, whether we engage business to business, civil society, whether we send tourists, or whether we engage with state governments. So in the end, I think it is, you know, reductionist to say that the America that we know, admire, and love is represented by a single person or a single administration, because I think that America is stronger than that.
Well, thank you, Constanza. I very much hope you're right. I will say that generations of investors have gone broke betting against the United States. We have capacity for great error, but also for great self-correction. And I think it's important to keep both of those things in mind. Having said that, and this will be the answer to your question, my favorite headline since since January 20th was on the day that Angela Merkel arrived in the United States, and the headline read, "Leader of the Free World Visits Trump." And there was a lot of truth to that, and I very much hope that she stands, like a mighty oak in the storm until the storm abates. And I do think it's entirely possible, because I can tell you this, based on not only my 71 years of living in this country and developing a feel for it, but also hard survey evidence, Americans will not take lightly the idea that the United States is becoming just another country in the world, and not in some sense an acknowledged leader of it. It is not the case, it is not the case that Americans as a whole accept the worldview that is implicit in some of what Mr. Trump and his advisors have been saying, and he will pay a political price. If America doesn't become greater, but in the eyes of the world becomes littler or diminished. I genuinely believe that. With regard, but just a point on China in that connection. I am not convinced that we are witnessing a diminution of America's role in Asia. We could simultaneously be witnessing a diminution of America's diplomatic role, but an intensification of America's military role. And it's that combination that worries me. I suspect that this administration will take, shall I say, a firmer stance, on on the famous, what is it called, the 9-dash line. And the Secretary of State has made remarkably few policy statements on anything, but he said something about that, along with North Korea. So, I would, and Mr. Trump, of course, has advocated a dramatic buildup of the U.S. military, including the U.S. Navy, a proposition that former President Obama ridiculed when Mitt Romney advanced it in 2012, along with the proposition that Russia was our great geopolitical enemy. With regard to Mr. Trump's popularity, I think everything that needs to be said about the staffing has been said, although I would point out that the Deputy Secretary of State and the Deputy Secretary of Defense are sort of an odd place to begin reducing America's bureaucracy, but that perhaps is an idiosyncratic view. I'll make just one statement with regard to Mr. Trump's diminishing popularity. I think a lot of people who voted for him assumed that his demeanor would change as he moved from candidate Trump to President Trump. That expectation has been disappointed, and that disappointment is showing up in survey research. If Donald Trump was the Teflon president, rather, if Ronald Reagan was the Teflon president, Donald Trump is the Timex president. He takes a beating and keeps on tweeting. And if I were to give Mr. Trump one piece of advice, which I suspect senior White House aides are giving him on a daily basis, it is, Mr. Trump, Mr. President, please give up your Twitter account. It is the single biggest source of self-damage in the administration.
Thank you all for your insights, your humor, and your heartfelt expression of your hopes and fears. This has been an outstanding panel and a great way to start the day. Please join. Thank you very much.